All right, guys, so we are back, and today I get to introduce a really interesting topic. We're going to be talking about the 1920s. And this really is a very fascinating topic because we're becoming increasingly more modern. There's going to be some conflict, but this is just a fascinating decade, right? We've come out of the progressive age, we've come out of World War II, and what we're going to see is that the U.S. emerges as this kind of modern force. It really is fascinating. Now, with that said, there is also in the 1920s something that maybe we don't talk about as often. That's this collision of values, the very traditional, maybe rural values that persist from pre-war times, is really colliding with the more modern and more urban lifestyle, and that's going to create some friction in the 20s, and going to see some problems with that. Now, I'm going to touch on a lot of different topics here. One of the big things that really highlights that division in culture, or collision in culture really, is the Scopes monkey trial. And I'm not going to go into great depth on this because I think this is big enough that there's going to be a separate video on that. So look for the Scopes monkey trial video. But ultimately, this is a trial in Tennessee that pits religion against science, and it does so on the backdrop of public education. So you want to talk about things that people get really passionate about. Science versus religion, how their children are educated, who's going to have control over what's taught in the schools, and is it going to align with what we value? And what we value may be different in different areas. So this is really kind of an interesting thing that we see because it deals with evolution and how that's going to be taught or not taught in school, and what each community has to say about that. So really a very interesting, they call it the Scopes monkey trial because, of course, it deals with evolution. But again, watch the video for more details on that. Really an interesting way to see in a very real world application that collision of values that we're talking about. We're also going to see the emergence of a lot of new technologies. Radio emerges. This isn't the first time we've ever seen radio, but it really kind of hits a golden age. It's something that becomes cheap enough to be widely available to a lot of people starting in the 1920s. And it's also going to change the way in which we interact with the world because it becomes the way that a lot of people get their news, sports, entertainment. There's going to be programs that they listen to just the same way that we watch television programs or Netflix and that sort of thing today. That was radio for them. That they did get their music, although to a lesser extent than what we would have today. And also religious sermons, right? Because that was such a big part of life in that day. You had all of those things on the radio at different times. So it's not the only way people got those things, but it is increasingly becoming the primary way that people are getting news, entertainment, sports, religion, so forth, right? So here we see that picture of the family kind of gathered around the radio the way we might gather around a TV today. Really a kind of an interesting shift in American behavior. In addition to radio, you're also going to see the growth of Hollywood. And this is maybe not quite the golden age, but it's not far from it because we're going to see tremendous growth. We go from silent films, which were entertaining and fascinating enough with the guys like Charlie Chaplin and some of these silent film actors, to what they called at that time the talkies, right? That's movies with sound, movies where you get to hear what was going on, and there was music and a track and the whole deal. So the very first talkie, the very first movie with sound was called The Jazz Singer, which today would be outlandish. I mean, it's about a white musician, with blackface on, trying to make it as a jazz musician and so forth. So, but really kind of an interesting thing that we see as celebrity culture emerges. We didn't have a whole lot of celebrities, not that were culture wide, right? But once the movies start being churned out from Hollywood, you see Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino, Clara Bow. Just name after name after name of people who are what we might call today influencers, right? Very, very notable personalities, and we see all of that emerging out of Hollywood. What else? We have the lost generation. If we're talking about radio and uh, Hollywood, then we also have to talk about literature. And what we're going to see is that in the post-World War I era, you have this new generation of writers that really seems very disillusioned, disconnected from what's going on traditionally in the United States. They seem directionless. Maybe they've seen war. Maybe they've had great tragedy. They've seen things that are hard to explain and kind of separate them from the rest of American culture. And so as a result, they don't do the traditional thing where they come home and settle down and start a family. They just kind of wander. They'll become expatriates and live in France for a while, or go to South America, or travel around Europe. And they write about their experiences, and their disillusionment really comes through in their writing. This is going to be guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, right? Gertrude Stein. There's a whole bunch of them, but we just kind of call them in general based on the tone of their writing. We kind of consider them the lost generation. They're very good writers, but they have a very distinct stamp on the style of writing and the topics on which they write about. Now, if we're talking about culture again, we have to talk also about the music, because the jazz age, the 1920s becomes the jazz age, right? And if there was a soundtrack to life in the 1920s, it would have been jazz. This is something that is really big, especially among the urban young. And there's going to be quite a bit more about this on another video that deals with the Harlem Renaissance and that kind of racial culture and whatnot that's going on there. So be looking for that as well. But jazz kind of is the soundtrack, and out of that jazz age culture, you also start to see culture changing for young women. We see the icon of the 1920s is the flapper. And these are young, modern, often urban women. I think if we were to believe the stereotype, you'd think that all women of the 1920s were flappers. And that's absolutely not true. Because they were so different, though, we have so many examples of photographs of them. We have to recognize that a lot of people were still very traditional, very kind of set in that older culture. So not every woman was, but only the young, only the urban, only the very modern, and even then, only a sliver of that population. But they captured the imagination of the nation, whether we were interested in it or whether we were kind of repulsed and saw it as something controversial. But they were iconic because of their fashion. They were iconic because of the hairstyles. Their behavior seemed to be very unladylike. They were willing to go out and dance and smoke and curse and drink and today do things that we wouldn't think twice about or that wouldn't catch our eye. But back then was something that really set them apart. All of this, by the way, is set against the backdrop of the Prohibition era. And so we see speakeasies. Now, the Prohibition era is big enough. There will be a separate video on that. So be looking for that, because that's too big to get into in this kind of brief overview. But we will talk also, and there will be another video on the Harlem Renaissance and the Great Migration, and on some of the racial tensions that go along with that. This is a fascinating time period. I mentioned that before. I didn't want to let you think that I was not going to discuss it or had forgotten about it, but it's big enough that we need a separate video to cover it. There's also a lot of racial tensions, right? With the growth of the Harlem Renaissance and this Black culture that really is moving them forward as they begin to fight for civil rights and sow the seeds of that movement. You're also going to see the rise of a counter movement, this racial tension. And here we see an image of the KKK kind of marching and rallying in Washington, D.C. Kind of a very weird thing to see our Capitol building and the street leading to it filled with KKK members. But we were not only worried as at least some segment of the nation about racial issues, we're also worried about immigration, and specifically about the infiltration of communism and socialism into this country. So again, there will be a video on that as well. All right, now we have to talk about kind of the car culture that is pervasive in the United States, because what we see is that unlike Europe, where things are developed from kind of medieval and Renaissance city styles, right? Things in the United States are far more spread out. And so cars become, in many ways, a necessity for us to get around. Now, Ford is going to introduce some new manufacturing techniques, right? Or adapt manufacturing techniques from other industries to fit in automotive manufacturing. When he does that, it's going to lower the cost of his automobiles because his plants become far more efficient. So the Model T becomes a really big car. It was introduced in 1908. It cost $825 in 1908. That was a large sum of money. However, 20 years later, in about 1925, the same Model T coming off the same assembly line, well, I guess not the same assembly line, but coming out of the same plants that have now become more efficient, they can now produce that same automobile for $260. Ford's goal was to make an automobile cheap enough that everybody who worked for him could afford one. Basically, he wanted to make it affordable to where it was something that people across all walks of life would be able to attain. In doing so, he's creating an economy of scale, right? And this becomes something that more people can afford to do, and therefore they sell more automobiles. So when they sell them at a lower price point, they more than make up for that by the volume that they sell. $260. That was not insignificant, but boy, we'd love to have automobiles that cheap today, wouldn't we? Now, Ford's plants also offered things that others didn't, right? He wanted to make sure that his plants were efficient, that his people were well trained, and that he wasn't wasting time hiring and retraining new people. So he paid people very well. He made it hard for them to leave by paying them more than what they could get elsewhere. Made people want to stick around. He offered better hours. He offered more benefits. There were all sorts of different things that he did to make life better for his employees. And because of that, these are things that unions had been pushing for years. Now, Ford was very anti-union, but he offered these things because they made good business sense, economic sense. And then, of course, other industries followed suit. Now, that's not to say that unions didn't get some of these wins in some areas, but really it was Ford that kind of helped to usher in this era of higher wages and better hours. Now, what I love to see here is that, and this is true in a lot of different areas, but when there is a boom in one specific industry, in this instance, the car industry, the automobile industry, then what we see is there are smaller ancillary booms in other industries that are supportive of that industry. So when everybody in the country begins buying cars, it's not just going to be a boom for the automobile industry and Henry Ford, it's going to be a boom for steel. And we're going to need more oil. We're going to need more glass, more rubber. You're going to see booms in construction because roads and bridges are going to have to be built to accommodate all this traffic. Housing. Now that people have cars, they no longer have to live in the urban centers. They can move out, and we see the creation of the suburbs. It's easy to get into work and live in different parts of town. So new housing is being developed. Whole new industries emerge. Because there are shorter hours or maybe weekends off or time off, now people can go on short vacations. They can take weekends. They can take a week every year to go and do something. And so you start to see vacation destinations emerge. There really are a lot of different things that are associated with the automobile in terms of creating jobs, creating opportunities, and changing the way in which we live our life. Now, that kind of leads us to the boom cycle of the 1920s. Now, there are boom and bust cycles. The 1930s, we're going to see a bust cycle. But right now, we're going to see a boom cycle. And what we'll see, and I'm going to zoom in on this because I think this is a pretty good graphic that shows it, is that incomes are increasing. When incomes increase, people spend more money, right? They buy more goods. When people buy goods, the companies that produce those goods earn higher profits. When they have those profits, then they will expand to hire more people or create new product lines or update their factories or expand their capabilities. But when they do that, they have to hire more people. And so there's now more people that are making a better income, and the process kind of repeats itself. It's very cyclical. That's a good thing for the economy of the 1920s. Unemployment was very low, wages were rising, new products were available, and they were available relatively inexpensively. So we love the boom cycle of the 1920s. However, as more people are spending more money, the 20s become a very consumer-oriented culture. Advertising kind of convinces the nation that we have to keep up with the Joneses. In order to be a proper American, in order to be middle class, we have to live a certain lifestyle. And that lifestyle comes with expenses. We want to separate ourselves from the lower class, so we buy certain products or certain brands, or we want the latest and greatest of this or that piece of technology or equipment or whatever to save us time, to save us, money, to whatever the case may be, right? And so as a result, we're buying and buying and buying rather than saving a whole lot. There's going to be a problem when we get into the 1930s, because in order to keep up with all these new products and things that make us kind of a middle class nation, it means that we're going to have the advent of buying on credit. So you can buy cars on credit and buying on installments. You could get credit at your local department store and so forth. All of this buy now, pay later. My man Dave Ramsey would not approve, right? But what it means is that people feel like they're doing all right, but they have growing amounts of consumer debt. And again, something that is going to really be a problem when we get into the 1930s and we see that boom cycle begin to reverse itself and become a bust cycle. So this is the 1920s in a nutshell. I love this decade because of all the glitz and glamour and modernization, but it also represents, if you look a little bit beneath the surface, you see some conflict and you see a collision of old versus new. And there are things that we're going to have to address moving forward. But I think that adds to the kind of romanticism of the 1920s, that there is so much going on. You guys, really do appreciate you watching. Make sure you subscribe and leave me any comments, right? Love to hear from you guys. Thanks for watching, and make sure that you watch some of those other videos on the Harlem Renaissance and the Prohibition Era and the Scopes monkey trial, right? To have a better understanding of the 1920s. Again, guys, thanks.